It all started when I woke up to the sound of someone hammering on my apartment door. That was the first fright I got that night, heart pounding in my chest as I grabbed the bat I kept under my bed and headed towards the door. First thing I do is look through the peephole to make sure it's not anyone sketchy, but I'm greeted by the sight of one of my neighbors. She looks terrified. She's covered in blood, and I can see just through the peephole that her face is a mess. I open up the door, she runs inside and immediately says, "You gotta get me out of here. My boyfriend's trying to kill me." I start to ask her what happened, and she says something like, "There's no time. Just please get me out of here. I swear to God, he'll kill you too for just helping me." That was what sent me into a straight-up panic, because if a guy was willing to beat his girlfriend up that badly, Lord knows that he'd be willing to put me in the ground. I just grabbed my car keys, ran downstairs with the girl following close behind, jumped into my car, then took off into the night. I remember asking her if she had anywhere I could take her, like a friend's or a relative's or something. She said no, and the best thing for us to do would be to drive to a motel so she could call the cops from there. So that's exactly what I did. I drove us to a motel and booked us a room. The clerk was obviously just as concerned as I was, but all it took was to explain that her boyfriend had tried to off her, and they were like, "Geez, make sure you guys call the cops at least." The girl, whose name I didn't know at that point, I just knew she was a neighbor, said that she'd go up to the room and call them, then asked me to get her some ice from the ice machine so she could deal with the swelling on her face. When I got to the room, she said the cops would be there ASAP, took the ice, put it on her face, then just burst into tears. I tried my best to reassure her, telling her she was safe and stuff. Then, when she finally calmed down, I asked her what actually happened back at her apartment. She told me her boyfriend was abusive, and that she'd been planning on leaving for a while, but that night was the night she'd finally got the courage together to announce it to him. She said he walked into their bedroom to find her packing a bag, and not long after that, everything went to chaos. She started helping herself to the little bottle of liquor from the minibar, but not after promising she'd pay me back for them once everything had blown over. I had no reason to disbelieve her at the time. I mean, I felt like we had a kind of bond established already, but I abstained because I thought I'd be driving back to the apartment pretty soon. I asked her if she was good to wait on her own while the cops drove out to her, but she asked me if I'd stay to keep her safe. She then made the point that if her boyfriend found the blood on my apartment door, she assured me that she'd left some on there while hammering on it, that he'd know she'd been there and he'd try to attack me, or worse. I'll be honest, I thought it was a pretty good point at the time. I hadn't seen the blood myself, but she was so covered in it that I believed her when she said that there was some on my door. Anyway, about an hour goes by and the cops still haven't showed up, and the motel rooms were arranged in a horseshoe shape, so we'd have seen them rolling into the parking lot if they had. I asked her to call them back to see what was going on, because obviously it was a really urgent situation, and I know that there was basically no way for the boyfriend in finding us, but I was still really paranoid that he would somehow. That's when the inconsistency started, because she gave me some lame duck of a reply like, "I'm sure they'll be here soon." If that was me, I'd have called 911 again if they hadn't shown up within like 10 minutes. So what was she so calm about that she was just cool with waiting for them for like an hour at that point? I put it down to booze, and at that point I was okay with waiting too. It wasn't like I had anywhere to be. I sure couldn't just go back to my apartment with that psycho supposedly just a few doors down. But that's also about the same time that I started checking out the amount of blood on her nightshirt. She had like an oversized t-shirt and girl boxers on, and like I said earlier, they were drenched with blood, but also with some blood splattered too, like little spots here and there. She had this cut over her eye, and she had a nasty busted lip, but it looked like way too much blood for just those small wounds. So I asked her if she had any other kind of injuries, like an abdominal wound of some kind that might account for all the blood on her. She said no, and that it was all from the busted lip in her eye. And immediately I start smelling nonsense. I asked her again what exactly had happened back at the apartment, and she started getting weirdly defensive about what she told me. I was starting to think it wasn't quite the abusive spouse kind of story that she told me the first time around, but I had no inkling of what was really going on. That being said, I was getting tired of waiting for the cops to show, so I decided to call them back myself. All I had on me was my wallet, my phone, and my car keys, the only three things I'd had time to stuff into the pockets of my shorts before fleeing the apartment. But when I take my phone out to call the cops, she says something along the lines of, "What are you doing?" I state the obvious, I'm about to call the cops back, and she's like, "Don't." I don't know if it was the way she was looking at me, the way she spoke, or the way she sort of tensed up when I told her that I was about to do that, but the mood in the room just shifted completely. I asked her why not, then just went right back to dialing 911. But by the time the operator spoke down the line, I looked up and saw she had a knife in her hand. She just said, "Hang up. Now." So I did. I'd never had a knife pulled on me at that point, and I can't overstate how terrifying it was. It wasn't even just the knife either. It was the overwhelming creepy sensation of knowing that all wasn't what it seemed. I wasn't hiding from the threat. I was with the threat. I'll be honest here. I basically begged her not to hurt me, and to my relief, she said she wouldn't as long as I drove her to the Canadian border. Given this was in Detroit, the border isn't all that far, but I didn't want to catch charges for aiding and abetting or whatever, so I knew I had to think of something to stop that from happening. It's not like I knew I couldn't tell the cops that I'd been threatened or whatever, but I also knew that the longer I spent in this girl's company, the more chances I'd have of being stabbed. So, I tell the girl that I'd drive her to the border, but that I needed to get something to eat first. I play it like I wanted to stop somewhere on the way, knowing she'd reason me down to getting something delivered from a 24-hour joint. She also stated that she'd be the one going down to pick the food up, as she didn't want me having the chance to sound the alarm. That's where she messed up, because she didn't seem to realize, to my infinite relief, that I could order from DoorDash and put something in the notes about needing the cops called to the motel. My whole plan hinged on there being a driver around that late at night, but thank God there was, and I was even able to show her the order without bringing up the notes section that mentioned needing 911 called to the motel. And the cops played it perfectly too. They showed up without any lights and sirens on, didn't park in the lot, walked up to the motel room without being spotted from the window, then just knocked on the door like they were a delivery driver. She walks over, opens up the door, then boom, they had a gun and a taser drawn on her before she even knew what was happening. She had the knife tucked into the back of her girl boxers, but the cops were wise to her drawing on them, and she hit the floor hard after they hit her with the taser. Turned out they'd been looking for her because, get this, she was the abusive partner who'd stabbed her boyfriend almost to death before finding some poor schmuck, i.e. me, to drive her to the border. Dude almost bled to death in their apartment but managed to crawl to another neighbor's place to get help. You should have seen the amount of blood in the hallway when I got back to my apartment building, and the whole place was crawling with cops and forensic gear. I thought I might be able to drive over to a friend's place to stay the night, contaminating a crime scene or whatever, but they had this section of the corridor closed off so I could actually get into where I lived. The cops came to my apartment in the morning to take my statement down and to fill me in on what they thought had happened. That's how I found out exactly what the deal was. It was 100% the craziest, most frightening thing that's ever happened to me ever in my life. And just the fact that I was part of it seems completely surreal to me. But the thing that sticks with me is how easily I swallowed her nonsense story at first. How I thought it was helping someone I knew, someone I could trust, when in reality, one wrong move, and I might not actually be around to tell you this. Back when I was in college, I used to work nights at my uncle's motel just outside of Baton Rouge. It was a pretty sweet gig for the most part. I was already a total night owl during the summers, so instead of staying home with my parents, getting on their nerves, and being bored stiff during the midnight hours, I got to watch movies, read comic books, order takeout, and get paid for the whole thing. I remember those times with a lot of nostalgia, to be honest, but every so often, I think about this one night where I happened across one of the creepiest things I'd ever seen. It might even be the creepiest thing I'd ever even heard of, too, mainly because of what it might have entailed and how many unanswered questions it left me with. It started with the motel's fire alarm going off. The fire alarm automatically alerted the fire department, so officially speaking, all I had to do was make sure all the guests evacuated properly. But then unofficially, with it being my uncle's only form of livelihood and him being terrible at making his insurance payments, it was always an unwritten rule that whoever was on duty would have to try their darndest to put the fire out before the whole friggin' place burned down. So, that's what I did. Once I saw smoke billowing out of one of the rooms, I ran up there with my fire extinguisher, kicked in the door, and was relieved when I saw that the fire was basically a small one in the center of the room. I just let rip on that thing with my extinguisher, then within a couple of seconds, the fire was out and I'd saved the day. Obviously, I didn't pay much attention to what else was going on in the room, and the fact that there was no one in it didn't faze me because I figured they evacuated like everyone else. My uncle had already been alerted of the fire, and he's been ringing the motel's phone like crazy, and boy did I feel like a hero telling him that I basically saved his entire income by putting the fire out before it could spread. He then asked me to check on the actual damage before the fire department showed, which was still going to be a while, hence why he'd always asked me to be Johnny on the spot with an extinguisher if there was ever a fire. So, I do as I'm told, heading back up to the room while reassuring the parking lot's congregation of guests that everything's going to be fine and that I put the fire out. Only when I get back to the room do I realize that the fire had been set in one of the small metal trash cans that was in each person's room. Someone had obviously filled the thing with God knows what, placed it in the center of the room, then just set the thing on fire before bailing out of the room. Then right as I'm thinking, why would someone do that? I realized someone had arranged a bunch of stuff around the room. They were clothes, kid clothes, and interspersed among them were a bunch of what looked like kids' drawings. Then when I checked out what the drawings were of, I realized it wasn't just the fire department that should be on their way. It was the cops, too. The drawings were of kids in cages, or sad crying kids with big angry-looking grown-ups towering over them. Then another was of what seemed to be one kid crying over a dead kid while the grown-up figures laughed. Seriously, they were so horrific that despite the heat and smoke still circulating in the room, I felt a little chill go down my spine. I immediately went to call the cops, then checked who was booked into the room and, more importantly, if any kids were booked in there too. There was just one guy's name in there, Cameron Odell. So what was one lone guy doing with so many kids' clothes? The drawings were horrifying, but it wasn't out of the question that an adult could have been responsible for them. The clothes, though, that was a different story. Right after the fire department arrived and they were checking the room over to confirm it was safe for the other guests to head back to their rooms, I asked the group of guests in the parking lot if there was a Cameron Odell among them. No one spoke up or raised a hand, and no one by the name or any other name booked another room after everything died down, so I'm guessing whoever was calling themselves by that name had gotten out of there following the fire. The cops showed up a short while after the fire department did, and I showed them all the clothes and drawings I'd found, along with the booking under the Odell name. Officially, their investigation would involve looking for potential arson, but the cops told me that they'd be looking into the clothes and drawings too if they ever caught the guy who tried to set the room on fire. And that was pretty much the last I heard of it. For the first few weeks that followed, I kept asking my uncle if they'd caught the guy who'd set the room on fire. Each time the answer was the same, no. I tried telling him about the kids' clothes and the pictures, but all he seemed to care about was that the damage to the room was minimal. Besides, I was his hero, having put the fire out and all, so whenever the subject came up, it was all just backslaps and that's my boy kind of talk. It was really hard to get to any details. Like I said earlier, what I'm mostly left with here are unanswered questions and a lot of half-baked theories of what that guy was trying to do. But there's one in particular that really sits with me. If the guy had a bunch of kids locked up somewhere, if it was him that was trafficking children and he was trying to dispose of the evidence or something, he definitely went about it in a really dumb way. But then, what if he was one of the kids that had been abused, and he was trying to draw attention to it some way? What if he tried to get people to listen to him time and time again? Obviously, there's a lot to unpack here with that one, and it brings up way more questions than it answers, but I really don't know what else to make of such a creepy situation. I just feel like there's some deep, dark backstory to the whole thing, but for the time being, I don't know what that is. Maybe in the years to come, if the truth comes out, I'll find out just what a crucial incident the motel fire was. Or maybe not. Maybe it'll just remain a mystery, just like so many other things in life. I apologize in advance for not being the best storyteller, but this is definitely a true story. It's also not my story as much as it is my mom's, who used to work at a motel in California back in the 80s. Anyways, one day a guy shows up to book a room, and I'm just going to refer to this guy as the guest, since I don't actually know his name. My mom got assigned to clean his room on the daily, but as time went by, she noticed that he always had the "Do Not Disturb" sign up on his room. So even like a week into his stay, she never once had a chance to clean his room. This didn't bother the cleaning staff too much, because the way my mom tells it, the guy was always super nice and friendly whenever he passed reception or bumped into any of the cleaning staff, always apologizing and telling them that he'd just clean up after himself. So if it saved them some work, they weren't exactly going to complain about it. Anyways, there came a point where the guy wasn't seen for a few days, and the "Do Not Disturb" sign wasn't on the door anymore, so everyone figured that he just checked out and they'd be able to clean the room again. So given that my mom had been assigned to the room like a month before, it came down to her to head over to clean it. As she got to the floor and unlocked the door to the room, a disturbing smell hit her. She couldn't figure out what it was, but she continued to survey the room, which, contrary to the guest's previous assurances, was disgustingly messy. Her words were that it looked like someone had thrown a party, even though everyone was pretty sure that no one else seemed to have ever gone into the room besides the guest. Anyways, my mom was still shocked by the smell, so she tried to track it down. Then as she followed the smell, she could tell it was coming from the hotel room closet. When she opened the closet, there was nothing but a wet-looking cardboard box on the ground, and my mom said the smell got way more intense, so she could tell it was coming from there. She said she had a strong suspicion that the guests had been using it to go to the bathroom in, so the last thing she wanted to do was look inside it. Instead, she puts on some gloves and covers up her mouth and nose, then picks the thing up to throw it into the trash. That's when she felt how heavy it was, like way heavier than if there was just some feces inside it or something. It was only when one of the other cleaning ladies smelled the same smell that they straight up said, "Somebody call the cops." Apparently, a few years before, this same cleaning lady had found a dead body in a room, as someone had a heart attack with the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door, and it took almost 2 weeks before they finally went to investigate. She said it was like the exact same kind of rotting smell. Definitely not anything else from the human body, so they called the cops so they could come take a look at it. The cops showed up, cut open the box with everyone watching. Then the officer just looked up to his partner with this numb expression, saying, "Call the coroner. We're going to 419. Someone had to explain to my mom that the number was police code for dead body. Only it wasn't like a whole body in there. That much was obvious because the box was too small. It turned out to be just a decapitated head. I don't really know many more details than that. This is almost 40 years ago now, and I couldn't find any internet archive stuff before I wrote this up, but my mom said that there was talk of the head belonging to a call girl who had gone missing a few weeks before. They gave all the guy's info to the cops, but apparently that didn't help. The credit card was stolen, and the guy had used the name on that card. Imagine being that person whose credit card got stolen, though. One day you think you've lost it or something, and then the next, the cops show up accusing you of having murdered a girl. Mom stayed working at the motel for maybe like a year afterward, and she only quit when she met my dad and moved into his place up in Vallejo. That story always kept me from ever wanting to work in a hotel or motel or anything like that, and no matter how desperate for money I get, I think I'd have to be very, very desperate to work anywhere you might see the darker side of human nature. I used to work at a motel that everyone said was haunted. I must have been there for maybe 6 or 7 months, and I hadn't seen anything of the sort. Granted, I don't believe in any of that kind of stuff, so it's not like I was out there with my spookometer, but one night, I had a little run-in with someone that had me questioning my stance on the supernatural altogether. So at this particular motel, we had what was basically an on-site diner that was just across from the rooms, and everything is single story. One afternoon, we were expecting 2 elderly sisters to check in for a few nights. These 2 sisters just so happened to be friends of the owners and fairly regular guests who came to stay on the owner's dime maybe 2 or 3 times a year. Only, I hadn't met them yet, so I had no idea what they looked like or anything. It was way past dark when they arrived, so while they're being greeted by the owner and their baggage is being unloaded by some of the other staff, I get the nod to head up to their room with a bottle of complimentary wine. So, I head to the bar in the on-site diner, grab a bottle of our best wine, 2 glasses and a tray, then head out of the back door of the diner and around to the back of the motel. This is a pretty crucial part of the story, as I'd been told the wine had to be a surprise. They'd never have accepted it otherwise, and the owner wanted a little showmanship for his friends, or more accurately, to make it look like he'd bothered to put some effort into it prior to their arrival. Either way, it meant that I didn't see the old ladies arrive, otherwise this story basically would never have happened. There's basically no one else around, and right after I put the wine into the motel room, I head out intending on scurrying away from the room so that the ladies don't catch me having planted their little gift. Only the opposite way I was due to head, I noticed one of the hallway lights was flickering. I swear to God, it was seriously like something out of a horror movie, because I turned to look, and underneath the flickering light, wearing a long, flowing dress, is a headless figure. At this point, it's important to note something about this whole dumb story about the ghost haunting the motel. Legend has it that it was a hung woman whose body had gone undiscovered for so long that she'd rotted to the point where her neck basically tore apart from the rot and the strain. Therefore, it was a headless ghost that was haunting the motel. I know that's about the lamest ghost story you've ever heard of, right? But then imagine being me, seeing that headless figure standing under the flickering light, and you can imagine why my heart went from 0 to 60 as I looked at something that I had absolutely zero explanation for. I think I gasped so loud and so much that my lungs felt like they were about to burst, and that caused the figure in front of me to turn around. Okay, it wasn't a ghost, like I said. There's no such thing as ghosts or spirits or anything of that nature. But there is such a thing as osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a condition that severely weakens the bones of people who suffer with it. And in older folks, it can mean that they end up with some pretty painful hunching postures, or in this old lady's case, bones so weak that she could barely support her own head. This meant that from behind, it basically looked like this poor old lady had no head at all. Anyway, she turns around, gives me this look as if she'd horribly been offended by my terrified gasp, and I'm forced to explain it away like, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you, you startled me. She just frowns, points up at the light, and says something snarky like, better get that fixed, young man, then waddles off along the corridor. I felt like a total idiot. I seriously thought that I was looking at the very same ghost whose existence I've been denying for months on end. I can't even lie. It was one of the scariest and creepiest moments I think I've ever experienced. Back when I was in college down in Florida, I used to work a part-time job at this pretty upscale motel. The motel had this pretty nice pool, and this one time, after a series of pretty gnarly rainstorms, I was tasked with cleaning it. This was really out of the ordinary, as we had an actual specialist that came in when the pool was that bad, but my manager said the guy was up to his eyeballs in jobs and wouldn't be able to come out for a few days, and since it was costing us guests, he told me that if I got it done, he'd let me go early and still pay me my full day wage. Absolutely no-brainer, so I accepted. Then about a half hour into the job, this absolute perfect 10 knockout of a girl around my age comes to the pool in her string bikini and asked how long it'd be until the pool was swimmable. I shrugged and told her I didn't know. that it was taking a long time as it was, and I'd only scooped like a quarter of the debris out of it. But then, to my luck, she seems content to just chill by the pool in one of those sun loungers until I was finished. I got where she was coming from. It was really hot outside, and as pervy as it sounds, I was glad to have some nice scenery to look at while I worked. After a while, she started making a little small talk, and after about a half hour of back and forth with her, I pretty much managed to clear the entire shallow end of plant trash. She then asked if she'd be good to dip her legs into the shallows, and I'm like, sure. But then as she does, I notice a bunch of small, dark things swimming out of one of the filters and towards her legs. She hadn't seen them because she was too busy looking at me, but I was seriously like, "Get your legs out of the pool." I straight up screamed it. She looks at me like I'm crazy, as I'd already okayed her putting her legs in to cool down, but when she looks down, she lets out this ear-splitting scream, then basically sprints back to her room in tears. If you'd never seen Florida water bugs, now's the time to Google them, and more specifically, to Google how big they can get. Somehow, I'd never seen those evil-looking things until right then, and Jesus Christ, they're a sight you're likely not to forget anytime soon. Worst thing is, they actually do bite people, which is exactly how they got their nickname of toe biters. They're not dangerous, like they're not poisonous or anything, but they're just about the last thing you want to see swimming towards your legs while you're dipping them in the pool. I'm not great with bugs either, so I noped out of there and told my boss that as much as I appreciated the offer of the day off, I wouldn't be carrying on cleaning the pool that day. He was literally like, you're alright, they won't kill you if they bite you. And I straight up told him that I'd rather he fire me than make me clean the pool while those terrifying little things were swimming around in it. Thankfully, he relented and told me to close the pool off by putting the chairs around it like a little fort until the pool guy could come out and completely drain and filter the thing. Apparently, they're pretty easy to kill just by using vinegar or something, but the pool guy still uses protective gloves and stuff because, get this, the water bugs can fake being dead, then just pop back alive into tricking you into thinking you're safe. That's pure nightmare fuel to me. Florida was fun, and I'm glad I got to experience living there while I was in college. But I sure don't miss all the tropical wildlife down there, and seriously, if I never have to look at another water bug for the rest of my freaking life, it'll still be too soon. Back when I was still getting some money together for college, one of the 2 jobs I worked was as housekeeping for a motel chain. It was on that job that I saw some of the weirdest, creepiest things I've ever put eyes on, and to this day it remains unexplained. I'm not suggesting what I saw was in any way supernatural, as I'm sure there's a perfectly logical and reasonable explanation for it, especially in a county with a real bad meth problem such as this one. But it definitely left me and my coworkers on edge for a few hours afterward. So, we're going from room to room, knocking on doors, calling out housekeeping and that whole ordeal. Me and my coworkers were leapfrogging each other, so doing every 3rd room or so as we worked our way along a corridor. Then, as we're working, I just hear one of my coworkers say, "Ay, Dios mío," which for those of you that don't know means "oh my God" in Spanish. Obviously, the other 2 of us come running to see what our coworker is so startled about, and I remember arriving in the room and just not being able to see what she was so freaked out about. The place was basically clean, apart from one broken window which was broken right at the top. The windows started about chest height, then went all the way up to the ceiling to let all this nice natural light into the room. Only when I looked right up did I actually see what she was so freaked out about. Leading up to the broken window, right on the ceiling, were dirty footprints, super visible against the pale paint on the ceiling. The 2 of us that came running were like, "How in God's name?" But the poor Honduran lady we used to work with was basically convinced it was a demon or something that had run along the ceiling before diving out of the window. A much more logical explanation, but granted still kinda crazy, would be that maybe 2 meth heads had been just throwing each other around on the bed, and that one of them had been actually able to kind of momentarily run along the ceiling for a second before crashing back down. Maybe that's how the window ended up getting broken too. But there was definitely no blood or anything to suggest that some kind of crazy accident had occurred. I guess the really creepy thing was seeing how freaked out her coworker was, how she kept clutching the cross around her neck and saying little prayers to herself. She seriously thought that something evil had been in there, and we actually had to talk her down and explain that weirder things happen when people are cranked out of their minds. She just wasn't buying it though, and she always refused to clean that room for the rest of the time I worked there. I cleaned it on many an occasion, and nothing weird ever happened while I was in there. That throwing each other up in the air thing was honestly the only way I've ever been able to explain it though, and I guess meth makes you do crazy things. But good God, running on the ceiling is a whole other level of crazy. In September of 1992, a music video company in Nashville, Tennessee, placed a listing in the classified section of a local newspaper advertising the sale of a $30,000 top-of-the-line computer system. The computer in question was an Apple Quadra 950 with 4GB hard drive and 30 megabytes of RAM. At the time, it was most certainly worth the 5-figure price tag, and there would most certainly be people willing to pay it. But it seems that in this case, there were people willing to kill for it, too. On October 7th, a man who called himself Tom Johnson responded to the ad claiming he was a freelance computer programmer and database consultant who was willing to make the advertisers an offer. The advertiser in question was 21-year-old Jeremy Rolfs, a videotape editor and student at Middle Tennessee State University, and a few days later, Jeremy met with Tom for a demonstration of the Quadra. To Jeremy's surprise, Tom ended up making an offer of $31,000, claiming he was desperate to secure such an advanced piece of hardware. He had just one request, that Jeremy deliver the computer to his office in Marietta, Georgia on October 24th. Marietta was 230 miles away, a drive that would take just shy of 4 hours, but considering Tom was offering $1,000 above the asking price, Jeremy agreed to the proposal. Then, on the agreed-upon day, Jeremy awoke before dawn in order to make the delivery on time. His 22-year-old fiancée, Heather Olfelman, had agreed to accompany him on the journey, and after just under 4 hours of solid driving, they arrived at a motel called the Knights Inn just off the Georgia section of the I-75. Tom had initially requested the computer be delivered to his office in a large industrial park, but at the last minute, he had called Jeremy to change the location of the meeting to a small motel room. His reasons were that the directions to the industrial park may have been a tad too complex, and to save time and effort, they could meet in a more prominent location. Jeremy was only too willing to agree to this, as it would save him a few bucks in gas money. Yet, little did he know, the change of location meant he was walking into a trap. When Jeremy and Heather arrived at the motel room, the man calling himself Tom told them that his business partner would be arriving shortly to check over the equipment. In the meantime, Jeremy and Heather decided to grab some breakfast while they waited, returning about a half hour later to learn that Tom's business partner was on his way. Tom then suggested, to save time, they could load the Quadra into the trunk of his car to make for a more fluid exchange. It appears that both Jeremy and Heather trusted their potential buyer, as they did so without question. What followed was around 20 more minutes of waiting, and when an exhausted Jeremy grew tired of hanging around, he asked if they could simply close the deal so he could begin the long drive back to Nashville. But to his horror, Tom produced a handgun from his waistband before telling the couple, "I think we can close this deal right now." Tom kept the gun aimed at the pair while he ordered them to wrap themselves up in some of the motel room's spare bed sheets, assuring them that this was only necessary to ensure that they wouldn't pursue him upon his departure. Tom continued to reassure Jeremy and Heather, telling them that the university would be able to claim an insurance check if they said that they had been robbed. The couple were understandably terrified, but Tom continued to reassure them, telling them everything would be fine if they neglected to resist. Yet as they lay there, wrapped up in the bed sheets, Tom produced a hammer, stood over Jeremy's body, and then struck him in the head with it. Jeremy later said he must have been knocked out for a few seconds because the next thing he knew, Tom was standing over a screaming Heather, subjecting her to the same brutal assault. When he tried to tell his fiancée stop screaming and he'll leave, Tom returned to Jeremy and began hitting him again. The couple were able to breathe a sigh of relief when Tom suddenly exited the motel room, yet just minutes later, he returned and began wiping down various surfaces that he touched as a way of removing fingerprint evidence. Once this was done, he brutally attacked Jeremy and Heather with a hammer again, before finally leaving for good. At around 9:30 a.m., a motel employee discovered a severely wounded Jeremy wandering around the parking lot, disoriented and bleeding. Both he and Heather were soon rushed to a nearby hospital, but sadly, Heather passed away as a result of catastrophic cranial damage just 2 hours later. Thankfully, Jeremy went on to make a full recovery and was released on October 27th, but was suffering from vertigo, hearing loss, and severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Outraged at such a brazen and violent robbery, local police launched an immediate investigation, questioning witnesses and searching the motel room for evidence. They found that one of the few clues that Tom had left behind was the murder weapon. The hammer was still wrapped in plastic with an attached card identifying its weight and SKU number, yet despite this, the police were unable to trace it to its place of purchase. Shortly afterwards, police learned of another curious incident that occurred just an hour or so before the attack. Around the same time that Jeremy and Heather were having breakfast, an unidentified woman had complained of a problem in the motel room which Tom had rented. Somehow, the police then came to believe that this woman was actually an accomplice of Tom's who attempted to sabotage the scheme when she learned that he intended to murder his victims. They hoped that this woman might come forward upon making a public appeal, but most probably out of fear of prosecution, she remained silent and anonymous during the remainder of the investigation. Police then announced that Tom had been driving a black cherry or dark brown Dodge Dynasty with a red interior and Tennessee license plates. According to the surviving Jeremy Rolfs, the man had sandy brown hair, was in his late 20s or early 30s, was around 6 foot tall, and weighed 165 pounds. Jeremy also noted how disturbing it was that the man went from a thoughtful, introspective guy interested in computers to someone who was cold, calculating, and deliberate. The man was evidently a dangerous and manipulative psychopath, and how those that knew him may have been completely unaware of his true nature. Police also announced that there was a great deal of evidence that Tom had attempted to pull a similarly murderous scam just a week before Heather's murder, but for some unknown reason, he failed to show up for the proposed meeting. 2 years later, police announced they finally had a potential suspect, a 49-year-old owner of a Nashville computer company named Thomas E. Steeples. Investigators noted that Steeples shared a striking resemblance to the composite sketch of Tom based on Jeremy Rolf's description. Steeples was already in prison after being convicted of a chillingly similar double murder which had also taken place in a rented motel room. In April of 1994, Steeples had lured another young couple by the names of Rob and Kelly Phillips, only this time, it was under the pretense of offering them a record deal. When they arrived, he ordered them to wrap themselves in bed sheets, then beat them to death with a hammer. Steeples was also convicted of the 1993 murder of one of his business partners, a Nashville bar owner named Ronald Bingham. He was also suspected of several attacks on young women, with his own wife testifying that he had tried to assault a woman in their backyard after luring her onto his property. Yet unfortunately, just as the authorities were preparing to prosecute the imprisoned Steeples, he died of a heroin overdose in his cell. Some believe it was a deliberate attempt at taking his own life, as Steeples didn't appear to have developed any kind of drug habit whilst in prison. What's more, the amount of opiates in his system post-mortem was enough to send even the most hardened addict into cardiac arrest. And furthermore, Steeples had a slim chance of being paroled for his part in the Phillips murders, but with a conviction for Heather's killing, that chance would have been taken away. Maybe he thought it was better to just end his life than spend the rest of his days locked in a cage. In her honor, Jeremy and Heather's family later created the Heather Uffelman Memorial Scholarship at her alma mater, Middle Tennessee State University. Yet soon, even more tragedy would befall Steeple's victims. Jeremy Rolfe later joined the Peace Corps as a telecommunications advisor and was sent to South Africa to oversee building projects in the post-apartheid nation. Yet on March 31st of 1997, he was suddenly killed in a traffic accident near Wynberg by a driver who had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel. He was just 27 years old. It's as heart-wrenching as it is horrifying that a man who barely escaped being murdered by a bloodthirsty psychopath then lost his life in such a senseless manner, especially when his killer received no official punishment for his misdeeds. Because the fact remains, as much as it seems overwhelmingly likely that Tom Steeples was Heather's murderer, it was never confirmed with evidence in a court of law. This means that there's a slim chance that the man who killed Heather Uffelman is still walking among us, and it may just be a matter of time before their desire to kill returns. In the early 1980s, the city of Chicago was plagued by a nightmarish series of horrific serial murders. After being chosen at random, the victims were kidnapped, mutilated, often murdered, then dumped in various locations around the city. Only one solid motive was established following the apprehension of the perpetrators: satanic worship. What you're about to hear is extremely disturbing and is most certainly not for the faint of heart. This is the story of the Ripper Crew. On May 23rd of 1981, 28-year-old Linda Sutton was declared missing by deeply concerned relatives. Just 10 days later, her mutilated corpse was found in a field in the Chicago suburb of Villa Park. Whoever had killed her had taken the time to slice off her left breast as a trophy of their grisly endeavor. The following year, during the early morning of May 15th of 1982, Lorraine Borofsky was opening up her realtor's office when she was snatched right off the street. 5 months later, her body was found lying on top of a grave in a Clarendon Hills cemetery, also with the left breast removed. 2 weeks later, a woman by the name of Shui Mack was abducted from Hanover Park, and when her body was found 4 months later, police were forced to accept that they had a serial killer on their hands when they found that the same gruesome amputation had been performed. Just a few weeks later, the killer struck again, dragging a young woman named Angel York into his van before he handcuffed her. Miraculously, Angel wasn't murdered, but suffered horrific injuries when the killer slashed at her left breast with a knife before tossing her out of the moving van. Angel was in the hospital when she was interviewed by the Chicago police detectives who were assigned to the murders, and it was then that she told them something truly chilling. The killer wasn't just some lone maniac targeting vulnerable females. He was being assisted by up to 3 additional accomplices. Angel was able to provide detailed descriptions of each of the suspects, but while detectives were scouring the profiles of known criminals, they were able to kill again. On August 28th of 1982, the body of Sandra Delaware was discovered on the bank of the Chicago River. She had been strangled and stabbed to death, and just like the other victims, her left breast was amputated. This was followed by the discovery of 31-year-old Rose Davis's body on September 8th. She had suffered identical injuries to the other victims, with the same signature amputation having been performed. There wasn't a break in the investigation until December 6th of 1982, when a woman named Beverly Washington was found lying unconscious by a railroad track. She had multiple stab wounds and her left breast had been cut off, but somehow she was still alive. Once she regained consciousness, she was able to give highly detailed descriptions not just of the suspects, but also of the vehicle they were using to abduct their victims. The van was traced to a man named David Gecht, who was promptly arrested on suspicion of murder. Police believed they'd be able to collate sufficient evidence to convict him during his initial period of detention. Yet to their frustration, they fell short and were forced to release Gecht after just a few days. Following his release, detectives worked night and day in order to compile more evidence, and Gecht's undoing finally came in the form of a motel receipt. Police were able to track down the motel's owner, who gave a lengthy testimony detailing Geck's stay at his establishment. He had rented 3 adjoining rooms with 2 friends of his, holding a loud, raucous party late into the night. But that wasn't all. The detectives were deeply unsettled to hear that the motel owner believed Geck to be involved in some type of cult. After hearing that Geck was the main suspect in a murder case, the motel owner happily provided police with the names of his friends, those being Edward Spreitzer and 2 brothers named Andrew and Thomas Kokorellis. After the police picked up Thomas Kokorellis, they forced him to confess that he and the others had taken women back to Geck's motel room, how the man himself referred to the motel as a satanic chapel. It was there that they drove their kidnapped victims after snatching them from off the street, and although the motel owner had heard loud music coming from the men's rooms, it was merely a way of drowning out the women's screams as they were beaten, violated, and murdered and mutilated. Thomas Kokorellis claimed that David Geck was the one responsible for the breast amputation and that he used a garrote wire to do so. After removing them from his deceased victims, Geck would slice off pieces of the amputated breast before eating them raw, telling the others it was a kind of satanic ritual that they should also partake of. Following this, he would inappropriately touch himself and finish onto the severed breast before placing them in a sealed box. Thomas Kokorellis claimed to have personally witnessed the contents of this box and claimed that there were no less than 15 severed breasts in it. He also claimed that Geck would have his way with the dead bodies of his deceased victims. Geck was clearly a maniac, but he was also highly intelligent and managed to conceal enough evidence that it was impossible to directly charge him with murder. Instead, he was charged with attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, and deviant assaults for the attack of Beverly, Washington, and was convicted in 1983. Before sentencing him to 120 years in prison, Judge Francis J. Mahone told Geck, "Not even an animal would do these things. Only a devil or a monster would." Next came the trials of Geck's 3 accomplices, starting with Edward Spreitzer in 1984. Spreitzer admitted that on October 6th of 1982, the gang shot 28-year-old Rafael Tirado and his friend Alberto Rosario at a phone booth in a random drive-by shooting. According to Spreitzer, he was driving Geck's van with Geck in the passenger seat when he was ordered to slow down. Geck then took 2 guns from a rear seat, told Spreitzer to stop the van, then opened fire on Tirado and Rosario. Rosario survived being shot, but tragically, Tirado succumbed to his wounds at the hospital in the hours that followed. In a bid to avoid the death penalty, Spreitzer pled guilty to the murders of 4 of the gang's victims, as well as on the lesser charges of attempted murder and aggravated kidnapping. During the sentencing phase, Spreitzer's attorney argued that he was a junior member of the Ripper crew and was acting purely on the orders of David Geck. She claimed Spreitzer was immature, impulsive, and simplistic, a man who would do almost anything to please his friend. The prosecution, on the other hand, called Spreitzer every woman's worst nightmare and labeled his accomplices cowardly weasels who roamed in packs to prey on women. His attempt was successful, and the judicial system took mercy on him, sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole as opposed to the death penalty. In 1985, it was Andrew Kokorellis' turn to be convicted of murder, assault, and aggravated kidnapping. The prosecution once again sought a death sentence, yet during the sentencing phase, Kokorellis' defense attorney took a similar approach as Spreitzer's, claiming that his client had been a follower, not an organizer. Once again, the tactic worked, and the jury spared Andrew's life after deliberating for just an hour and a half. Instead of receiving the death penalty, he too was sentenced to life in prison without parole. However, 2 years later, Andrew was tried for the death of Lorraine Borofsky, and the details of her kidnapping, violation, and murder were too much for the court to hear. It was convincingly argued that Andrew had engaged in inappropriate actions with a dead body, and in light of this and many other perverse details, he was sentenced to death. On the day that he was due to be executed, Andrew declined the offer of a last meal, with his last words being, "To the Borofsky family, I am truly sorry for your loss. I mean this sincerely." He then recited a verse from the Bible, Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. As a reward for his detailed confession, Thomas Kokorales also managed to avoid the death penalty. At the time of his arrest, Thomas Kokorales was a painter with no criminal record, meaning his trial judge took a degree of mercy on him that his accomplices did not receive. With an IQ of 75, he was described as having a borderline range of intellect, and was said to be more motivated by fear than any kind of perverted desire. Thomas pled guilty to Borowski's murder, taking the death penalty off the table in exchange for a 70-year jail sentence. But following good behavior and a successful parole, he was released from prison on March 29, 2019. As of June 30, 2019, Thomas resides in Aurora, Illinois. And in an interview with a local news station, Thomas begged the public to change the perception of him, stating, "Everybody thinks I'm a monster, but I'm not a monster." Despite his pleas, it's both perfectly reasonable and understandable to view Thomas Kokorales as a profane and predatory monster. After all, he was a willing participant in some of the most heinous and horrific murders the city of Chicago has ever known. Thomas was well aware that David Gecht was practicing cannibalism and inappropriate actions with dead bodies, all in the name of Satan, and he didn't do a thing to stop it. His moral grandstanding means nothing when he allowed dozens of innocent women to be subjected to some of the most despicable treatment imaginable. The legacy of the Ripper crew is the stuff of nightmares, something that none of us are sure to forget in a hurry. But unlike similar cases, there is no comfort to be taken in knowing that the perpetrators are all behind bars or 6 feet under. And that's because a member of one of the world's most horrific snuff gangs is free to walk among us, having caused untold agony, having taken the lives of the innocent, and potentially having tasted human flesh. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to eat your weenie hot dogs.